For a decade, Julius Caesar had conquered Gaul, commanding fiercely loyal legions, while envisioning a Roman Republic freed from the suffocating grip of an oligarchic monopoly. But his sole reward from the state was a twisted legal snare, an ultimate senatorial decree designed to strip his immunity and force him into fatal prosecution and exile. Crossing the Rubicon as a condemned outlaw, he soon found himself trapped in Hispania, starved by an impassable, flooded river and mocked by a well-fed, entrenched enemy. Yet, from the depths of freezing mud, Caesar unleashed the ultimate counterattack, directing his starving veterans to dig impossible trenches that bent nature to his will. By mathematically manipulating the landscape, he shattered the Pompeians' invincible position, showing the known world that true power lies not in inherited wealth, but in unyielding ingenuity. Was this bloodless victory the triumph of a visionary liberator against a corrupt system, or the terrifying birth of a dictator who would manipulate the earth itself to rule? The answer to this monumental question lies not on the blood-soaked battlefields, but deep within the rotting foundations of a dying republic. The geometry of conflict. The Spanish mud. Liberty and the laws are high-sounding words. They will often be rendered, on a cool estimate, as privilege and vested interests. This was the cold, unyielding arithmetic of the late Roman Republic in the twilight of the 50th year before the birth of Christ. The established world order, a colossal hegemony stretching from the fog-drenched shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched deserts of Syria, was not brought to its knees by the sudden, apocalyptic violence of barbarian hordes or by the righteous fire of angry gods. At the dead center of this collapsing paradigm stood Gaius Julius Caesar, a man branded an outlaw by the very state his conquests had unimaginably enriched. Against him was arrayed the formidable might of the entrenched senatorial oligarchy, championed by his former ally and son-in-law, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. The tension across the Mediterranean basin was absolute, a suffocating atmospheric pressure bearing down on every citizen, patrician and plebeian alike. The Roman world was a violently stretched tendon, a complex web of unpayable debt, political patronage, and suppressed, violent rage. It was waiting only for the slightest pressure to snap and plunge millions into an abyss of civil slaughter, from which they would never truly emerge. The year is 49 BC. The Roman Republic is no longer a functioning political entity. It has fractured into a theater of war between rival oligarchic factions. It is plunging into the dark, uncertain abyss of civil war, a conflict not merely of clashing swords and splintering shields, but it is plunging into a silent, suffocating struggle governed by the unforgiving laws of logistics, geography, and starvation. The transition from the Roman Republic to the sweeping autocracy of the empire was not merely decided by the heroic charges of cavalry across blood-soaked plains. It was, instead, a brutal, grinding mastery of the earth itself. In January of 49 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar led his hardened veterans of the 13th Legion across the shallow waters of the Rubicon. He crossed not just a physical boundary, but the threshold of Roman legality. He was defying the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the ultimate decree of the Senate. And he was instantly transforming himself into an outlaw in the eyes of the Republic. To understand the sheer desperation of Caesar's march, one must first understand the invisible, ironclad trap that had been laid for him in the marble halls of the Senate. The conflict was entirely rooted in the weaponization of the state's legal apparatus. The Optimates, the ultra-conservative faction of the senatorial elite, had watched Caesar's populist rise. And they had watched his unprecedented decade-long conquest of Gaul with a mounting, paranoid terror. They understood that the Republic, as it existed, was an oligarchic monopoly. It was a fiercely guarded economic system, where aristocratic creditors ruthlessly vied with the state for labor and crop surpluses. And there, crippling debt dynamics systematically tied the plebeian clients to the lands of their patrician patrons. Electoral corruption, the infamous ambitus, was the normalized currency of power. And any attempt to reform the distribution of land or wealth was met with state-sanctioned murder. Caesar's supposed crime, the transgression for which he was to be utterly destroyed, was not the subversion of an unwritten constitution. Rather, it was his terrifying willingness to loosen the oligarchy's overbearing grip upon it. To eliminate this existential threat, the Senate invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the Senate's final decree. Ostensibly, this was an ancient, sacred emergency measure designed to protect the state from violent riots or sedition, granting magistrates the extraordinary power to bypass legal restraints and execute Roman citizens without a trial. In the winter of 49 BC, however, the decree was twisted from a shield of the Republic into a bureaucratic guillotine, aimed directly at one man's neck. The Optimates did not use martial law to protect the Republic. They used it to bypass legitimate political pushback, a fundamentally tyrannical act veiled in the sanctimonious rhetoric of ancient liberty. They demanded that Caesar disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a politely worded request, backed by the promise of total political and physical annihilation. To return without his imperium, his legal immunity as a military commander, was to face immediate, fatal prosecution, financial ruin, and exile or death at the hands of enemies who had already preordained his guilt behind closed doors. To retain his army and cross the border of his province was mathematically defined as high treason. This was the ultimate institutional dead end, a flawlessly engineered legal snare from which there was no diplomatic escape. Caesar, stripped of all legal protection by the very laws he had sworn to uphold, recognized the profound hypocrisy of his enemies. In his bitter, precise correspondence, the raw emotion of a cornered titan bleeds through the austere Latin. "I was not going to overthrow the Republic," he reasoned in the freezing darkness of his command tent, "but since you are utilizing constitutional measures meant to protect the Republic as a political tool to suppress your political rivals, I am left with no choice." The Republic, his beloved Rome, was absolutely in the hands of madmen who viewed the preservation of their immense wealth as entirely synonymous with the survival of the state. Standing before the freezing, shallow waters of the Rubicon River, the legally defined boundary of Italy, Caesar faced a profound psychological threshold. He was not a megalomaniac driven by naked, mindless ambition. He was an illegal, rogue commander forced into a desperate survival against a rigged, corrupt system. "The die is cast," he murmured, stepping into the freezing current. It was the solemn, terrifying acknowledgement of a man who realized that when the law becomes an instrument of murder, the only recourse is the sword. Caesar, holding an empty Rome and a divided Italy, possessed only the loyalty of his legions and a mind uniquely suited for the invisible war of military engineering. The exiled Senate, cloaked in the absolute legitimacy of ancestral tradition, did not merely raise an army against him. They mobilized the entire infrastructure of the known Mediterranean world. They commanded vast naval fleets, controlled the inexhaustible grain shipments of Egypt and Africa, and possessed the limitless treasuries of the East. To fight the Senate was to fight the very earth and sea, a paradox of power where his enemies sought to crush him through the slow, agonizing strangulation of supply lines. He was an illegal ruler facing a legitimate, global embargo. He ushered in a grim new era, a war defined by relentless engineering, weaponized environmental manipulation, and agonizing logistical endurance. The men who marched under Caesar's eagles were not just soldiers. They were builders, diggers, and laborers who carved their leader's ambition into the bedrock of Europe. Against the established, traditional might of the Roman Senate, Caesar opposed a mechanical ingenuity and a veteran discipline that would ultimately shatter the old world order. This is the chronicle of that invisible war. The conquest of hydrology in Hispania. The collision of Caesar's desperate physical action and the Senate's political maneuvering manifested first not in Italy, which Pompey and the Senate had hastily abandoned in a shocking display of strategic cowardice, but in Hispania. Knowing that he could not immediately face Gnaeus Pompey Magnus in Greece with a hostile, veteran army at his back, in the spring of 49 BC, Caesar turned his gaze westward toward the rugged expanses of Hispania. His objective was to neutralize the battle-hardened legions, commanded by Pompey's loyal legates, Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius. When Caesar arrived at the city of Ilerda, he did not find an enemy eager for the glory of the open field, but a masterfully entrenched force occupying a heavily fortified hill, sitting atop immense, virtually inexhaustible logistical reserves. They had entrenched themselves near the city of Ilerda, a towering fortress perched upon an impregnable hill, flanked by the rushing, treacherous waters of the river Sicarus. The landscape was a jagged theater of steep ravines and unforgiving valleys, a place where nature itself seemed explicitly conscripted into the Pompeian cause. The Pompeian generals intended to fight a cold war of attrition, allowing the brutal Spanish sun and the natural exhaustion of an invading army to do their gruesome work. In June, the skies opened in a torrential fury. The deep snows of the Pyrenees melted in a sudden, catastrophic deluge, sending a roaring wall of water down the Sicarus. Within hours, the violent overflow completely obliterated the wooden bridges Caesar had hastily constructed to maintain his supply routes extending back to Gaul. The architectural trap snapped firmly shut. Caesar's army was marooned on a narrow strip of saturated land between the flooded Sicarus and the equally swollen river Singa. The sheer horror of the logistical war became terrifyingly clear. Across the impassable, churning torrent, Afranius and Petreius sat in comfortable, wall-fed superiority. They had stockpiled immense quantities of grain within the thick stone walls of Ilerda, their supply lines stretching safely into the untouched, fertile hinterlands of Celtiberia. They watched from the high ground as Caesar's men, the proud conquerors of Gaul, began to sink into the freezing, gray mud. Foraging became an absolute impossibility. The local Iberian tribes, observing the seemingly doomed position of the invading army, swiftly withheld their provisions and declared their loyalty to the Senate. Starvation began to stalk the Caesarian camp. The price of a single modius of grain skyrocketed to 50 denarii, a sum that mocked the empty purses of the legionaries. Men grew gaunt, their eyes hollowing out as they scavenged for whatever pitiful roots, wild grasses, or bark could be torn from the muddy earth. Afranius and Petreius did not need to draw a single blade. They simply let the raging river and the gnawing hunger do their grim, silent work. The Pompeian generals wrote triumphant, arrogant letters to Rome, assuring the Senate that the rebel dictator had been permanently neutralized by the sheer weight of his own logistical impossibility. But the Senate fundamentally misunderstood the psychological resilience of their enemy and the devastating, world-altering power of his military engineering. Faced with a disaster that would have broken a lesser commander, Caesar turned to engineering as his strategic pivot. He understood that to fight the Pompeians, he first had to conquer the river. Drawing upon the memories of his perilous expedition to the distant shores of Britannia years prior, he ordered his men to abandon the futile attempt to rebuild massive timber bridges against the raging current. Instead, he commanded them to construct shallow draft coracles, frames of woven wicker tightly wrapped in the hides of slaughtered pack animals. In the dead of a moonless, freezing night, a detachment of his most trusted soldiers carried these frail vessels miles upriver, navigating the treacherous darkness. They crossed the dark, churning waters of the Sicarus in absolute silence, securing a hidden bridgehead on the opposite bank before the Pompeian sentries could even sound an alarm. With a tenuous foothold established, Caesar threw his engineering corps into a frantic effort, constructing a new, heavily fortified bridge in just 2 days of unceasing labor. The sudden, miraculous breach of the river barrier shocked the Pompeian generals, but Caesar was not content with merely crossing the water. He intended to weaponize it entirely. Recognizing that a direct, bloody assault on the rocky heights of Ilerda would cost thousands of irreplaceable lives, he deployed his legions as earth movers rather than combatants. He ordered the excavation of immense, parallel trenches designed to systematically bleed the swollen Sicarus dry. Today, beneath the modern urban sprawl of Lida, Spain, the earth still holds the faint, asymmetric scars of this ancient geometry. Layers of compacted sediment reveal the precise, linear incisions of these massive trenches, documented by modern archaeological surveys. Day and night, thousands of starving men dug into the hard Iberian soil. Caesar's engineering units, the unsung heroes of the legions, began the Herculean task of excavating a sprawling, complex series of massive trenches. These earthworks, yawning roughly 30 feet wide, were not built for defense, but to bleed the river dry. They were designed to artificially divert the raging waters of the Sicarus, spreading its fury over a wider area and breaking its strength. Day by day, inch by muddy inch, the relentless digging took its toll. But the geometry of the trenches worked. They artificially diverted the river's massive flow into the channels, lowering the water level until the once fearsome torrent became a navigable ford. By systematically lowering the water level and creating an artificial, traversable ford, Caesar dramatically reversed the fortunes of the campaign. He regained his lost mobility, reconnected his forces, and turned the environmental weapon against his enemies. The redirected river, now threatened the Pompeians' own access to life-sustaining water. The trap had been sprung, forged from mud and human sweat. The very landscape the Pompeians had relied upon was being systematically dismantled. The psychological impact on Afranius and Petreius was catastrophic. Terrified of being cut off, Afranius and Petreius abandoned Ilerda and initiated a desperate, chaotic retreat toward the Ebro River. Caesar relentlessly pursued them, not with the intention of slaughter, but with the cold, mathematical calculation of the logistical snare. His cavalry continuously harassed their rearguard, slowing their march to an agonizing crawl, while his infantry, moving with supernatural speed over the rugged terrain without heavy baggage, outmarched the retreating Pompeians and seized the strategic defiles ahead of them. Afranius and Petreius found themselves completely surrounded on a barren, waterless hill. Now, the roles of the invisible war were brutally reversed. The arrogant hunters became the desperate hunted. Without access to the river, the Pompeian army began to suffer the maddening agonies of thirst. For days, they baked beneath the relentless Spanish sun, their draft animals dying and filling the suffocating air with the stench of rot. They dug deep wells into the hillside, finding nothing but dry, unforgiving rock. Caesar simply waited, constructing impenetrable lines of circumvallation around their camp, ensuring not a single drop of water could reach the dying men. On August 2, 49 BC, the culmination of this siege of thirst was realized. Without the glory of a major pitched battle, the psychological and physical pressure broke the Pompeian resolve. Reflecting on this bloodless but utterly devastating maneuver, Caesar wrote in his own meticulous records, the Commentari de Bello Civili. By these means, he reduced the enemy to such distress that they were forced to seek a new position and eventually surrender, having been cut off from their primary water source and fodder. Entirely cut off from supplies and parched by the summer heat, 5 Pompeian veteran legions surrendered without fighting a major pitched battle. When the proud, aristocratic generals finally descended from their hill to surrender their emaciated, broken army, Caesar unleashed his most devastating psychological weapon. He did not crucify them. He did not enslave their suffering men. He granted them absolute clementia, complete and unconditional mercy. He disbanded their legions and allowed the generals to walk away completely unharmed, retaining their dignity and their lives. This act of calculated, freezing grace was a masterstroke of political annihilation against the Senate's propaganda machine. It systematically dismantled the Optimates' carefully constructed narrative that Caesar was a bloodthirsty, tyrannical monster. It exposed their own vindictive cruelty and permanently shattered their moral authority in the eyes of the Roman populace. Caesar officially claimed this bloodless victory as an example of his clementia, his political branding of mercy. Yet, modern historical analysis reveals the cold, calculated psychological warfare beneath this rhetoric. It was a profound victory that demonstrated Caesar's unparalleled ability to weaponize the landscape itself, achieving total capitulation through attrition rather than slaughter. The capitulation at Ilerda was Caesar's first truly meaningful military victory since seizing the Italian peninsula. By neutralizing the Senate's most veteran legions in the west, he had secured his rear, and his legendary clementia completely shattered the Senate's propaganda. With both Italy and Hispania now under his absolute control, it seemed an unstoppable momentum had been forged. One might easily assume that the rest of the civil war would follow this trajectory of swift, inevitable triumph. But waiting across the treacherous winter waves of the Adriatic was not a soft politician. It was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the most experienced, battle-hardened conqueror of the age. And he was waiting with the vast, limitless wealth of the East and a naval armada that controlled the entire Mediterranean. To end the war, Caesar would have to attempt the impossible, blockading a vastly superior, well-fed army with a starving one. In our next episode, the true horror of the Invisible War begins. A 15-mile cage of earth and wood, a battle of starvation, and the terrifying day Caesar's invincible veterans finally broke and ran for the first time in a decade. A day Caesar barely escaped with his life, his army fractured, and his legal standing reduced to less than nothing, a catastrophic disaster that absolutely no one could have ever imagined.